Thank you all for joining us on this chilly London November morning. So as Jane mentioned, I hang out at MIT and Said Business School, University of Oxford. So I get to hang around with a lot of very smart people. And then I spend part of my time working with private sector and governments on translating some of those ideas into action. And so today I'm going to talk to you about some of that work in big data, AI, and impact. There's a friend of mine who is the chief investment officer of a very large company. He manages a $100 billion US portfolio. And they came to him one day and they said, "Hey, we just signed the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, the PRI. Go figure out what that means." So here's a gentleman who's trained in the traditional disciplines of asset management and investing, who's trying to navigate his way through ESG and through responsible investing. And he's asking logical questions like, how do we know it's working? And he's not alone. There's a rising tide of people who feel that their money should be deployed for impact. And they're turning to their money managers and saying, how can you do that? So BBMG talked to 22,000 people in 22 countries and asked them about how they feel about money and impact, how they feel about profit and purpose. And they found that, yes, there were some people who said, I only care about making money. That's about a quarter of the sample. And they found some people who said, I only care about philanthropy and doing good in the world. That was another quarter of the sample. And there were, in fact, some people who said they didn't really care one way or another. That was about 10%. But a good almost 40% of the folks that they talked to said, I want to see my money put to work and make more money, but also have positive impact on the world. And they termed these aspirationals. And this is multi-generational. This is not just millennials or Gen X or baby boomers, or it's not any one segment. This crosses various age groups. But there's a rising tide of people who want their money to be put to work for impact and return. And so now we see $63 trillion of assets have signed on for the UN PRI. In the private family office world, about $5 trillion US of assets are being deployed in private investments in companies. This is about double the size of all venture capital and private equity globally. And when we went out and talked to more than 200 billionaire families, we found that more than 90% of them wanted to see, family members wanted to see their money put to work with profit and purpose. Candidly, the professional family office executives who worked for these families were struggling to figure out how to do that because of this issue of measurement. How do I know that it's actually working? So today, I'm going to talk to you about 3 big ideas with regards to measuring impact in big data and AI. First of all, surveys are terrible. And I will explain to you why I make that statement that surveys are terrible. In fact, impact aggregates, these indices that you can rent from people like MSCI and Sustainalytics, are also terrible. Then I'll explain why. However, I do have some good news. There are new tools of big data and AI, machine learning-driven systems, that can actually let us measure outcomes. And with a better understanding of which actions lead to which outcomes, we can then make better decisions. So those are the 3 big ideas that I'm going to talk about today. By the way, just out of curiosity, does anyone recognize who that gentleman is who's drawing on the chalkboard? Well done, sir. Okay, so big idea number 1, surveys are terrible. Right? Well, what do surveys tell us? Surveys tell us what someone thinks that they think. They tell us what they think you want them to think. There's a lot of bias intrinsic in surveys as they're trying to please the surveyor. And a lot of people answer questions in a way of how they want to be perceived by their friends and family. what they want their peers to think that they think. So surveys are a measure of convenience. People do surveys a lot of the time because we can. Hey, it's something we can measure. Measure, I put in quotes, right? But it turns out that they are an unreliable predictor of future behavior. If you look at how someone answers a survey and then you look at what they do next, it's not very well correlated. And let me emphasize, mobile surveys are not innovation in impact measurement. There was one very large, very prominent brand name impact investment group that very proudly told me that they were innovating in impact measurement because now they were doing everything in mobile surveys. Well, yeah, they saved money on doing surveys, but it's still not measuring impact. Then they told me that MIT and Oxford have nothing to teach them about how to measure things, and so I sort of knew that conversation was over. So then people say, well, what about MSCI? Aren't they doing all sorts of good measurement of things? I call MSCI, and I don't want to pick just on them. There are about a dozen firms that sell these aggregate indices of ESG. Sustainalytics is another one, but there's a long list, right? These are, I call, check the box impact measurement. In fact, they're so bad, a colleague of mine at MIT, Roberto Rigobon, started something that he calls the Aggregate Confusion Project. Because he started looking at these aggregated indices of environmental, social, and governance factors. And he tried to see if let's say, if they are good measures of ESG, then, an index from one company and an index from another should have a similar score for a business. But when he plotted them, he found, so this is comparing one rating agency to another, there's almost no correlation. If these things were correlated, this would be a solid straight line. Instead, it looks like someone dropped a bunch of iron filings on the paper. Right? And why is that? Well, a lot of how these indices are built, they start with open source stuff because it's free, right? They're trying to save money when they build these things, they make more profit. They want it to be non-intrusive because if it's intrusive, then management won't respond, and so they won't get a complete sort of scan of the universe. They want it to be continuous because they need to keep selling you these indices, so you keep buying it from them. So they have to constantly update it. And then there are all these new privacy laws that govern the data that goes into these, constructions of indices. And what you get is something that is not a very good measure of ESG, right? So in his research, he found, for example, there was one company that was in the top 5% of one rating and the bottom 20% of another. This is just insanity. Okay, so if you can't use surveys and you can't use MSCI, how are you going to measure ESG? How are you going to measure impact? How do you know where to allocate your funds? And I want to emphasize what Peter Drucker said, which is, if you measure it, it gets managed. And so if we desire to drive change in certain directions, we need to be measuring the right things. Okay, so big idea number 2. We can use new techniques of big data analytics mediated by AI, by machine learning systems, to measure outcomes. So one example, Professor Alex Pentland from MIT created a new computational social science called social physics, which can understand and predict human behavior at scale. So this is all of the telecom data for an entire country, a small country, Andorra, and it's aggregated, so people's personal privacy is protected. So one of those dots is like 25 or 50 people. It's not one person. But the blue dots are French people, the orange dots are Spanish people, and the white circles are sort of where there's traffic congestion. And I don't know if you can see on the video, it's a 3D topographic map of the city of Valle Andorra built out of white Lego, and then they project data on top of it. And what this is being used for is to actually re-architect the economy of the entire country. Now that there's new insight into what's going on in this country, you can begin asking questions and changing policy based on what answers you get. And this discipline of social physics is so powerful that the UN Secretary General came to Professor Pentland and said, can you help me out measuring the SDGs? And his name's Sandy, Alexander Sandy. So Sandy Pentland and others formed a Data Revolution Council that is now helping measure the SDGs using new techniques of big data. Here's Professor Rigobon again, the guy who does the Aggregate Confusion Project. Before that, he did another project called the Billion Prices Project. So Professor Rigobon was building econometric models of Latin America, and he found that the answers that were coming out of his models didn't make any sense. And he realized that was because the inputs were terrible, because the government statistics offices were all lying about inflation, or at best, they had poor measures of inflation that they were able to report on. And so he created an AI engine that forms a basket of about 200 or 300 consumer goods across over 100 countries. And now he can deliver a daily rate of inflation. Now I get a better understanding of what's going on within each country. Instead of having to wait 6 or 12 months for a national statistics office, he can now, report in near real time. And so you can uncover interesting things, these discontinuities between the reported rate and the actual rate of inflation. So this is just one example. This is the price of fresh food in China. So the orange line is the actual price, and the blue line is what the government statistics office reported. We can also use space technology to understand what's going on, to measure instead of estimate or guess. We can measure everything from, carbon emissions to even economic statistics. People are developing GDP indices off of light intensity from cities. So this lets us formulate a new model of impact measurement, right? Using a variety of big data tools. And in order for this to matter, investors need to demand better measurement. When I asked one fund manager why he was still using MSCI, he said, because the LPs aren't asking for anything better, and so I can just get away with it. I can still market my ESG fund because they're not asking for anything more rigorous. So LPs need to ask for better answers from their fund managers. And this then can drive more effective outcomes. So, big idea number 3, if we have better data going into our decisions, we're going to get better decisions and better outcomes. So I've just launched a project that I'm calling Engineering Innovation Ecosystems, right? So there are a lot of governments that are trying to set up innovation districts or innovation zones or innovation clusters in their cities. And each time that they do this, I talk to them and they say, they're basically inventing the tools from scratch. Everyone's reinventing the wheel because no one knows for sure what are the interventions that really drive the best outcomes. So we're going to aggregate the various policy interventions that are used. We're going to measure GDP using some of the tools that I described here today and tie those to the policy interventions, and then hopefully provide a playbook so that the next time someone goes and does this, they're going to know which interventions are optimal for producing the best outcome. So, just to recap, big 3 ideas: surveys are terrible, new AI tools can help you measure outcome, and then we can make better decisions. I'm Dave Shrier. I invite you to contact me if you want to argue or agree with or talk further about these or other topics. And I think we have time for a few questions, actually, before I step off stage. Yeah.
Question for David?
My name's Chris Middleton. I'm a journalist from Diginomica.
Hi.
Hello. Really fascinating presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
A very quick question. I'm sorry if it's dumb. Aren't a lot of the AI systems likely to be trained on the same flawed data that some of these agencies are using? How do you get around the problem of of big data that's flawed, which is itself trained the AI systems? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and data quality is something I think people need to spend more time talking about. It's not a sexy topic, so it's a little bit like eating oatmeal with no sweetener, but all these blockchain systems people are building with immutable data, we want to make sure we're getting the right data into those systems before we make it permanent. So similarly for these decisioning models, we want to make sure that we have very good quality data that's used in them. At least for the projects that we're doing, we're getting original raw source data and then we're assessing it ourselves. There are other tools to assess data quality. When you talk about everyone being trained, using their AI models being trained on the same data sets, that might be for things like image recognition on the internet. We're not doing that kind of stuff. So we're using raw feedstock data, we're assessing the integrity of it, and then we're, where there are issues, we're adjusting the models accordingly. Yeah.
Another question over there.
Thank you, David. Eric van der Clay. Having been involved in feeding into policy for a national government, particularly on the subject of creating ecosystems, one of the most vexing questions we face is migration and people migration.
Yeah.
Are you going to analyze data so that we can make a very profound argument for or against enabling a policy environment that favors migration for the prosperity creators?
So there is actually quite a bit of good work that's been done in that area already. And not to keep everybody in suspense, the data says that immigrants are 50% more likely to start new companies and create jobs than native-born citizens. So migration is statistically established to generate economic productivity. And there are a variety of guesses as to why that might be, but this is not one study, this is a series of studies by different researchers. So we aren't studying it specifically in the project that I mentioned, but we could, and we also have a large body of prior work to build on for that. I'd certainly be happy to talk to you about that further because it's something that I care a lot about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One more question up the back, and David will be here till about 12, so if people want to catch him after you'll be able to see him outside.
You mentioned that LPs don't have awareness with regards to the data that they're demanding.
Yeah.
Are there 3 strong ways that we can put pressure to help raise awareness, but also to help them ask for better data?
So one thing I am trying to do is I am trying to get the word out, raise awareness that the LPs should be asking sharper questions. And, I would be very interested in other opportunities to even boil it down to, here are the 3 to 5 questions you should ask your fund managers. There are people who are moving in this direction. Some of the bigger sort of asset allocators and consultants are beginning that education process. So for example, Hermes has an initiative in this area led by a guy by the name of Tim Humans that is, again, working to try and increase the professionalism of ESG investing. I know that Pictet has some exploration in this area, and there are others. So the Europeans actually tend to be a lot more sophisticated about this than the Americans, in my experience. So that's good news for Europe. But I'd be also delighted to have an opportunity to speak further with you about that if I can get in front of an audience to deliver this message and deliver simple tools for LPs.
Thank you so much. Let's put our hands together for David.